Hello, this is Paul Lucas with Jumpstart Nature Photography. Today we're covering the art of photography or ideas around composition, part 3, image construction. And as I always like to remind you in the introduction here, you can see more of my work at paullucasphotography.com. I'm happy to come and speak at your local organization for no charge, do a Jumpstart Nature Photography presentation. I'm available for classes and workshop for hire. And if you'd like copies of any of the presentations on the Jumpstart Nature Photography video site, or if you have any questions about photography, please drop me an email. My email address is paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. And as always, I'd like to encourage you to participate in my online critique sessions. Please feel free to contact me. There's some details here, but if you have other questions or would like to participate, drop me an email at paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. So we're in the art of photography, the composition section. There's the 3 parts, right? This is the goals of the course. The craft of photography is, of course, how we use our lens, our camera, our knowledge of the exposure triangle, and some other tools to realize our vision. The composition is creating that vision. And then we'll talk about the creative use of light in upcoming ones. So composition, image construction, part 2 in the art of photography. Perspective versus viewpoint. So viewpoint is where we see the subject from. I mean, do we look at the subject from above or down or to the side? Where is that? So here's an example of a dragonfly on the end of a flower. In this photograph, the idea is that we get down on the same level as the dragonfly. If we were shooting from the side or above or something else, it's going to change the viewpoint. So often getting to eye level helps with bringing you into that photograph and engaging you with the subject. So perspective is how we see the subject, which is really often driven by focal length. And here's kind of a classic style or definition of perspective visually, giving you that 3D feeling, right? The trees, there's a very strong leading line down those rows of trees to that house in the end. So very strong, traditional kind of classic perspective look with a 3D feel because it leads your eye into the photograph. You have elements that help to visually draw your eye towards that house. And also perspective, as I mentioned, it's by the use of focal length. So let me back up just a moment. So this was, a medium range 42 millimeter. This is actually shot on a crop sensor camera. So 42 millimeters Nikon. This is a 1.5 times. So this would actually be about 64 millimeters. So it's just a hair over. Remember the discussion about focal length, and 50 millimeters is a normal lens, we call it. That gives us about the same amount of expansion, contraction as we see with our eyes. So this was shot with a 42 millimeter lens on a DX crop sensor camera, which would give it 64 millimeters. It's also a cropped picture. So that also draws us more into it and gives us a little more of a kind of telephoto view. We're kind of compressing the scene a little bit more than what our eyes might see. This is shot with a very wide angle lens, 17 millimeters and a full frame camera. And I'm literally in this photograph just feet away, a couple feet away from the front corner of this tank. And you can see out I'm low to the ground, and so it kind of distorts it, but you can see, the idea of how the different focal lengths affect the perspective. It's not only the focal length of the camera, but also kind of the location of the photographer in taking the picture. Another kind of subject here, so we're closer, again, a full frame, shot on the same day, at the same location of the side of a tank, using a 55 millimeter. So this is a little bit of a viewpoint perspective combination idea, right? And here I'm using, note in this composition, it's an f2.8 on the lens, meaning that I have those lens as wide as open as possible, and I'm trying to do a selective focus. My idea is to get selectively focused the front part of the tank where it says U.S. Army and let the rest of it blur away. All right. Some other ideas. So photographs, when we take them, they're two-dimensional objects. And the world is three-dimensional, right? if we count time, that's a fourth dimension. So we do have 3 dimensions, but not in the traditional height, length, depth kind of idea. So to create 3-dimensionality from our photography, we use a variety of things like leading lines. We use contrasting foregrounds, middle ground, and background. We use contrast in our photograph and in our post-processing to create a 3-dimensionality feeling from our 2-dimensional photograph. So foreground, middle ground, background, FMB. Here's an example of a foreground and middle ground. The foreground is the grasses in the front. The middle ground is the pond, and then the island across is the background. So this gives us a sense of depth as it leads our eye across and through the photograph to the bell tower on that. The equal weighting doesn't mean they have to be equally in 1/3. It's just the kind of the textural importance. So there is a textural contrast as well, right? Some grass, the water, and then the trees provide some textural contrast as well. And that adds also to the idea of the foreground, middle ground, background, and our elements in giving us a 3-dimensional feel. Here's another example of a foreground, middle ground, background, right? We have a little swath of beach here with some sand and rocks in the foreground. We have the lake as the middle ground and the sky and the sun as the background. And again, that leads our eye across that and gives us a sense of dimensionality, 3 dimensions, right? So again, it's a textural contrast to help with, it can be even a color contrast, differences in texture and color that helps to change and move our eye through the photograph and give us a sense of depth. All right. Corners, edges, and anchors. Now, I think this is a key construction element of construction in our composition to really keep in mind. It really differentiates a decent photographer from an excellent photographer, thinking about the corners and edges especially, as well as anchors in our photograph. So elements increase importance as they move towards the edge. It means like our eye is often drawn to elements that are stuck on the edge. So we need to be careful not to place unimportant elements near the edge. If we want to emphasize that, move that compositional element towards the edge. And we need to think about the space near the edge. We want to give breathing room to our subjects along the edge. Sometimes in photography, in my classes, we talk about the 3 bears, right? Goldilocks and the 3 bears, where she says, each thing is like, this porridge is too hot, this porridge is too cold, this porridge is just right. So we're looking for the right amount of porridge and leaving some space for elements along the edge. Also, just not specifically for nature and landscape photography, but to keep in mind is if you're taking photographs of people or animals, birds or other animals, we want typically, we like to have the subjects looking into the frame and giving, if I'm on the left side of the frame and I'm looking towards the right, it's better, or if I'm looking to the right, it's better to place me towards the left side of the frame and give me some space to breathe. The same with animals. We like to see them going into the scene rather than being bunched up along the edge. It makes us feel very uncomfortable, unless that's your intent, to create a lot of tension in that photograph. So corners can be positive or negative, meaning there's something in the corner or there's nothing in the corner. Kind of an example, the water flow in the corner, lower left-hand corner would be negative space because it's really, there's not any photographic real element or compositional element. The rock could be an anchor on the right-hand corner. Conversely, the plants up at the left could be a kind of anchor in this photograph. Corners can be, like, as I mentioned, positive, negative. Here, there's no information in any of the 4 corners. So those corners would be, it's just negative space. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's just there's nothing there to distract the eye. So in this composition, think of the location. We'll look at this photograph one more time coming up in one of our compositional discussions. But think about the location of the leaf, leaf. Look at the contrast between the blue and the green in the water. That's a reflection of some pine trees, or at least conifers, I think, in the background. And also they're kind of at an angle, right? There's a little bit of a angle cutting through the bottom third of the photograph. Those were all intentional compositional elements I thought about when taking the photograph and then creating the final image. There's nothing wrong with elements touching the edge of a photograph. So in this one, I purposely did a soft focus. I was experimenting with close-up using an extension tube, and I intentionally tried to get generally a soft focused image, and also I intentionally had the leaves touching the edge or cut off. The key thing about photographing something with being cut off like that or having elements on the edges or tangents is to show that it wasn't an accident, that there was an intent in the way that the photograph was composed. So you can see that in this final composition, I intended to cut off. I made a commitment to not showing all the petals around some of the edges. So just as an example, it's very contrived, but just to show you, here there's a tree on the right-hand side. It looks like it was an accident in that composition. So the actual composition is this, right? You need to give your elements room to breathe. But I think that helps you. It's a contrived example, not any kind of special composition, but it gives you the idea that if you're going to cut off something, do it with intent. Now, there's no reason you couldn't take a composition of a tree and have the trunk of the tree, maybe 1/2 or 2/3 of the tree on an edge. But it really, again, depends on the overall composition of the photograph, the vision you're trying to create, etc. You don't necessarily need the entire tree as an element to understand that. It could be used as an anchor in the corner, the trunk of a tree. This tree, in my opinion, it would be too small even if I got close enough to only cut off part of the trunk. So again, this looks more like it was an accident rather than an intentional part of the composition, right? Okay, so to speak, your turn. I know you can't give me any feedback directly, but so in this is my original composition. I was limited. I didn't have a macro lens with me. A macro lens is a specialized telephoto lens that lets me get in close. So I was using a telephoto lens. Macro lens, the optics are designed to allow you to get closer to the subject and bring it in very close. So I can be literally inches, less than a foot away from the subject. I didn't have a macro lens. I had a 200 millimeter lens on a DX and APS sensor-sized camera. And so this is effectively like a 300 millimeter lens length, 350 or 1.5, right? Yeah, 300. Sorry. And it has a close focal length of 3 or 4 feet. So I had my tripod pointed down on the ground, up 3 or 4 feet off the ground. That was about as close as I could get, and this filled the full frame. So I looked at this, and had what composition in mind. I couldn't exactly get the shot I wanted. So I think the elements on the right side are kind of distracting because it's just a little too much busyness over there. And it's a change in the texture of what we see in much of the composition. So I had to crop it in post-processing. And this is a crop I decided on. I think that better captures, first off, I want to emphasize that yellow leaf. But I want to leave enough of the other elements in there to contrast against it, but not to detract from it. So that was my final composition. Just to show you the before. I think it gets a little bit lost, especially with the stuff on the right. It's distracting. And I think the crop helps to emphasize that yellow leaf. And all the elements work together to enhance the color contrast and texture contrast. Rule of thirds. So remember, we're going to call it the tool of thirds, right? No rules. So this is a good place to start. Don't always rely on the tool of thirds. I mean, you can. I mean, just be creative and use compositional ideas in different ways you haven't thought of. Experiment, right? There's no fixed way you have to stand when you take a photograph. You can move in a variety of places. You can change your lens. You can change your focal length. You can change your shutter speed. Try all those different things. You find a composition. Don't feel like you have to move on. I mean, sometimes you're at places where there's a lot of great photographs. You want to get them done. And other times you have the time to just like work one compositional subject. So spend time experimenting with that. So the tool of thirds, oops, I'm saying it bad. The tool of thirds, it's a very old classical idea in composition, but basically you would divide your picture by thirds horizontally and vertically and frame key subjects at cross points. So remember we talked about the leaf photograph. So when I took the photograph and I did the post-process work on it, I didn't have an overlay like this, but I kind of said I wanted to locate that in the lower right-hand corner because of two things. There's a slight angle that makes a small triangle in the left-hand corner of the blue water. I know there's some trees sticking up, but there's a contrast in the colors, contrast in the texture, and then the location. So it kind of helps to guide the eye towards that leaf. So just the lines, the tool of third lines, and how that might fit in the composition. Now, the things don't always have to be at the cross points. You can use the tool of thirds when determining the horizon, or the rule of thirds, tool of thirds. I need more coffee this morning. You can use the tool of thirds when thinking about where you want the horizon. Now, you can also, if a composition calls for it, you can split the frame, right? Put the horizon right in the middle. In this example, with the tool of thirds, often you can, shooting a scene like this, you can think about, do I want a third or less of the water or land and 2/3 or more of the sky, or vice versa. So you can kind of experiment with the different placements. They don't always have to be right on the third line. They could be below it or above it, somewhere, anywhere in between. It's just a tool of thirds is just a starting point. I chose the composition this way because I wanted that it's actually a piece of concrete, looks like a big rock. I wanted to provide a visual anchor in this photograph, and I didn't want to line that up. I wanted to line it up in that corner. I wanted a visual anchor in that corner. So the horizon worked out to give it space to breathe. Remember, just enough porch to give that piece of concrete enough space to breathe in that corner. It ended up that the horizon was at about 1/3. If the clouds were more interesting, I might have wished to have more sky, to have, even if, clouds higher up in the sky, right? Other things are sometimes bullseye compositions are good. If we have some symmetry, like in a plant or whatever, those are also good. This was shot with a full frame 200mm lens. This is not a macro lens, so you can see, even if you don't have a macro lens, you can often find subjects and get great close-up type of photographs with a telephoto lens. And as you can see, the key thing to me, or an important thing in photographing flowers like this, is like, what is the background? We want to make sure try to make the background as least distracting as possible. So some of the yellow elements might be a challenge, but I think it worked out pretty well in this photograph. And again, I used a 200mm lens. I was backed up, 6 feet or something, and zoomed in. This lens goes to f2.8, but I wanted to make sure I got as much of the petals. Again, my focus was on the center of the flower, but I wanted to get as much of the petals in focus while keeping the background as out of focus as possible. So f4 worked out for that. And remember, in talking about the exposure triangle, so you can see I picked f4, even though that's pretty wide open, but it was an overcast day. It had just stopped drizzling, and I was lucky enough to catch that water drop on the left-hand side, I'm sorry. And you can see, though, I wanted to make sure that I was on a tripod, but I wanted a good shutter speed to freeze that image to make it as sharp as possible. So I had to bump my ISO from 100 up to 800, even with f4, even with a fairly wide aperture opening. There's the rule of odds, another great place to think about or start, but not necessarily. So often in photographs, there's more dynamic, more energy in the elements if there's an odd number of things in the photograph rather than an even number. So there's a pair of these flowers in this photograph. This was shot with a macro lens. You can see the details around ISO and shutter speed. There were not three that I could get on a similar plane. So the key in shooting a close-up like this with a macro lens is the subjects have to be close to the same plane. Otherwise, it's hard to get all the subjects in focus, as well as getting the background blurred out. And remember, I said in close-up flower photography, often we want to pick a good background to blur it out to emphasize the flower rather than to draw our eye to the background. So here we can see here's one idea using a rule of odd, just a single element, or here's the other flower. So just some thoughts in compositional thoughts, right? Rule of odds, right? There we have go from 2 to 1. And you can kind of see and decide which of those photographs are more appealing to you. And these are actually crops of this original photograph. Whoops, sorry, of that original photograph. So for the exercise, for this specific exercise and example, that's what I did. Okay, your turn. Again, I know you can't give me feedback, but here we go. So I don't do much wildlife photography. Once in a great while, I experiment with it. And anyway, I had borrowed a 300 millimeter lens and was trying some shots out. So here, we have four objects, right? For the ducks and stuff, and kind of a static composition and photograph, in my opinion. Just to note, I used f8, 300 millimeter lens. So we're going to have a very shallow depth of field. f8, I wanted to make sure I could get enough in focus. I wanted the absolute sharpness of the lens. I want the subjects in focus. Notice my ISO is at 1600 to get 1/2000th of a second. So when shooting wildlife, often we have to get to 1000th or 1/500th, or more, right, to get the very sharpest image. So here's a crop, changing the composition with 3. So you can kind of decide whether you think I think, bringing it in closer, of course, right, emphasizes the subjects. It makes the reflections in the water more interesting. I think it gives it a little more energy in the photograph. I would like to, if there were a way to take out some more of the water at the top, because I don't think that's as interesting, I'd do that, but I think it would change too much of the compositional elements. So the 4 and the 3, rule of odds, just something to think about. So a key thing to remember, before pressing that shutter, you've made your composition. Before you press the shutter, our eyes and our brain will focus in so strongly on the subject that we will miss other distracting elements in our photograph, and they will not show up until we look at the back of the camera or we get home. So before you've created your composition, before you press that shutter, check the corners, check the edges. Look for any dark or bright objects that might catch your eye. They're very distracting. If you have a very bright object, it's going to draw your eye away from it. Look for the oops in the photograph. Is there a branch or a bush or some leaves or something, some grasses sticking out in a corner that don't make sense in our composition? So look around the corners, the edges, look for any of those elements. If you can slightly recompose your picture and eliminate them in the field, do that. If not, you can often take care of them in post-production. And then again, look at where your subjects are placed in the frame. Are you intentionally want to cut them off? Do you want to include them in the frame? Don't make it look like you didn't shoot with the intent of having too much or too little of an edge element in the photograph. And leave for elements close to the edges or corners, leave a little breathing space. All right, that's the end for this presentation. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks.